Well, on January 6th of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt made a speech to Congress where he cast this vision of how he saw the American life being after the war would be over. And he talked specifically about 4 different types of freedom that he hoped we would have. And the first was freedom of speech. The second was freedom to worship. The third was a freedom from want. And the fourth was a freedom from fear. Now, I think we could all agree that these are freedoms that we all want in our lives. And certainly since then, we've seen to varying degrees these freedoms come about. But I actually think there's a 5th type of freedom that he missed, and it's the freedom from our sinful nature. I don't know if you know this, but we all have a sinful nature. We all have this prone to wander and to go after things that hurt us and hurt other people. And it's just something that we're born with. And once again, to varying degrees, we're aware of that sinfulness. Maybe today you woke up extremely aware of your sinful nature. Or maybe today you woke up extremely aware of how broken the world is. And in Galatians chapter 5, Paul actually talks about this freedom of sin, freedom from sin that we all are looking for. And he says this in verse 13, "For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters." Amen. So if you're a Christian, know this, you actually have a calling to live in freedom, that your Christianity, your faith, should be a faith of freedom. He goes on to say this, "But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love." Now, if you've been in the church for any amount of time, what you know is that Christians can kind of fall off either side of this knife edge. And on one side of that knife edge is people who live according to law. They think it's all about following the rules, and if I do enough good things in my life, then God will love me. Then I will be accepted into His kingdom. On the other side of the knife edge is something called license, where people live in this sort of like, well, God has saved me from my sins. Certainly Jesus has died for my sins, and so now I have a license to do whatever I want. And having a license can be dangerous. I'm teaching a 14-year-old how to drive right now, and I'm pretty scared about her getting her license. But and maybe you have a certain tendency to live on one side or the other. Do you live by law, or do you live by license? But in the middle, on that knife edge, is the believer that lives in liberty. And this is what Paul is actually challenging us to do, is to live a life of liberty. Now, then he says, hey, don't just live a life of liberty and not do anything about it. No, it actually is liberty that is lived out in love, which results in us serving one another. And that's what you need to understand, is that your liberty must be lived out in love. Because liberty that's tried to be lived out without love ultimately ends up being license. It leads to a life where we've got all this freedom to do whatever we want, and it doesn't result in a better life for anybody else or a better life for us. It doesn't result in us loving one another. But liberty with love results in service. It results in a group of people like the local church being the type of people that the city recognizes are there to serve and love them and care for them and meet needs. And ultimately what we want people to see is Jesus through us. And so I want to encourage you in that today. Do you live by law? Do you live by license? Or do you live by liberty?